Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Steve Bromage, the Executive Director of the Maine Historical Society. On behalf of MHS, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 2023 Maine History Maker Awards celebration. We are so honored to have the opportunity to celebrate and thank Earle Shettleworth for all that he has done for Maine. Get used to it, Earle. I think there's going to be more of those. Earle has been a dear friend and collaborator to so many people in this room, including to my colleagues at MHS and to me. So the Maine History Maker Award recognizes contemporary Mainers who are doing things today that will contribute to Maine's long-term strength and vitality. We created the award to illustrate the fundamental connections between Maine's past, present, and future, and to recognize the role that each of us has to play as stewards of Maine. We have a number of previous awardees with us tonight. I think Vin Verino is here from the Chinquette family. We have Michael Chinquette. We have Peter Mills, I know, is out here. Everybody could wave. From the LL Bean family, we have Sean Gorman and Linda Bean and Nate Clark. And Harold Pacious, I'm not sure if he's made it. There he is. Okay, so hello, welcome to the club, Earle. That's the club. Maine Historical Society's mission is to preserve and share Maine's story, something that we now have been doing for 200 years. We do that through our expansive collections, exhibitions, digital resources like the Maine Memory Network, and by partnering with organizations throughout the state. As we embark on our third century of service to Maine, we are focused on building our capacity to provide information, context, and perspective for issues that matter to Mainers today, and on providing a place of connection for all people who care about Maine. I'd just like to briefly recognize the MHS Board of Trustees and staff for their leadership and incredible hard work. If board members and staff could raise their hand, thank you. So, on to Earle. As you will see this evening, Earle has been focused on learning about, preserving, and share Maine history for virtually his entire life. I mean, entire life. He has helped preserve thousands of buildings which are now central to Maine's sense of place and to the spirit of towns, villages, and cities throughout Maine. He has saved tens of thousands of historical items that document what makes Maine Maine. He's accumulated vast knowledge about Maine and mentored countless people who carry forth his knowledge and spirit. Again, many of us here tonight. And he has helped communities throughout the state take pride in their part in the Maine story. So tonight, we are delighted to have the chance to tell Earle's Maine story. Now, I can't tell you how helpful it is to have an honoree with an encyclopedic memory who has kept every piece of documentary evidence related to his whole life and who is such a generous friend. So thank you, Earle, for your close collaboration on tonight's program, and to each of you in the room, in the audience, for helping us to celebrate Earle and the joy that you have all expressed as we do this tonight. Before we get started, I would like to express our thanks to all of you for supporting Maine Historical Society's work. We couldn't do it without your membership and participation, financial support, and being out for events like this. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Linda Bean for her collaboration and to her new business, YS by Water, for being our lead sponsor tonight. I want to thank the many, many members of our host committee for their incredible generosity. And we'd like to thank our organizational sponsors, ranging from big businesses to small historical societies. So thank you all. So I think we have a really lively and fun program tonight. So with that, let's get underway. So the first part of our program introduces you to Earle's family, how they got to Maine, and to a precocious young historian who I think you will recognize. Few people reflect Maine better or have done more for the state than Earle G Shettleworth Jr. For virtually his entire life, he has been focused on learning about, preserving, and sharing Maine's history. With unwavering focus, he has built an encyclopedic knowledge of Maine, built on a profound respect for the diversity and contributions of its people, communities, and regions. He is an icon to people throughout Maine, a rock star historian with a vast following. He is an advisor and counsel to legislators and civic leaders. He is the leader of our field, a generous mentor to curators, preservationists, and historians of all backgrounds. He is an invaluable guide and collaborator. He is an inveterate sharer and giver. He is a dear friend. It is Maine Historical Society's honor to show our gratitude and appreciation for Earle by telling his Maine story. Like most of us, Earle's Maine story is an immigrant story. His mother's family arrived in Portland in 1893, part of a wave of Danish immigrants. Earle's maternal grandfather, Knud Knudsen, was born in Denmark in 1868. He served in the King's Guard, married, and emigrated to Portland with his young family in 1893. He found work at the Portland Stove Foundry, purchased a home at 56 Hammond Street near Back Cove, and became a U.S. citizen. Tragically, he was widowed and left with 5 young children to raise when he was 32. But soon, he wed Earle's grandmother, Marie Nielsen. Marie was his sister-in-law and in a similar situation. Marie had been widowed in Denmark and emigrated to Portland with her 4 children in 1895. Knud and Marie were married in 1900 and soon had 4 children of their own, including Earle's mother, Esther Knudsen. Esther was born in 1905 into the household on Hammond Street that would soon grow to 13 children.
And they lived down below Nissen's on Hammond Street. Everyone knows Munjoy Hill comes down, you hit Washington Avenue, then it keeps dropping down, then it flattens out. That was all filled in after the fire of 1866. They lived at the bottom of the hill right below Nissen's on the water. We have a photo of them, with a garden and a goat tied up to a fence, and then there's the ocean, and of course now it's all buildings.
Knud was gruff and instilled hard work and frugality in his children. Marie was a softer touch. She was a successful dressmaker, raised and sold produce, and championed education. Esther grew up surrounded by an extended family that was quickly becoming Americanized, moving up and part of a thriving Danish community in Portland. Esther attended Portland High School, graduating in 1923, where she played on and managed the basketball team and was an excellent student. She impressed her teachers, who helped her earn a scholarship to Colby College, where she studied English and made lifelong friends. After graduation in 1927, Esther taught and coached basketball at several high schools, including Scarborough High. She then settled in as an English teacher at Deering High School, where she would teach until her children were born, then substitute, and resume full-time when her children were grown. Meanwhile, most of Earle's father's family were recent immigrants too, from England. They came during the 19th century, pursuing opportunity created by the Industrial Revolution. Earle's grandfather, George Shettleworth, was born in England, moved to Montreal with his family, and settled in Portland, Connecticut in the 1870s, where he went to work for the Pickering Governor Company as a machinist. Earle's paternal grandmother, Emma Jane Bartlett, was the only one of Earle's 4 grandparents who was of old Yankee stock. Her father was a ship captain, Daniel Bartlett, from Madison, Connecticut. George and Emma married in 1879. Earle's father, Earle Shettleworth Sr., was born in Middletown, Connecticut in 1899 and grew up and went to school there. He started working when he was 10, tried many occupations across the Midwest and in New England, and finally, in 1921, went to work for the Woolworths Company at the age of 22. He was trained by Woolworths in New York City and would go on to manage stores throughout New England. In 1933, he was assigned to the store in Portland and moved to Maine. In Portland, he met Earle's mother, Esther Knudsen, and they were married in 1935. The Woolworth store in Portland thrived during World War II as local shipyards and the city's population boomed. Earle Sr. and the family prospered. In 1940, the couple made a big symbolic move for a family of recent immigrants. They built their own home on Hersey Street directly across Back Cove from Esther's parents' house and moved to the suburbs. It was only a short distance away from Hammond Street, but a world away as the family entered the American mainstream. The Portland Woolworths did so well that in 1946 the company decided to transfer Earle's dad outside of Maine. But by then, the family was firmly rooted in Portland and wouldn't leave.
In 1946, Earle's father opened his first five and dime store in Freeport under the name E. G. Shettleworth and Company. He was a neighbor, business colleague, and friend of L.L. Bean.
The story is that L.L., my grandfather, he came across the street to greet Earle Shettleworth Sr. before his grand opening. But before he left, he said, "Is there any way that you would be willing to let me put an arrow on top with our name on it on your building pointing across to ours?" And in discussing it, they both thought it might be beneficial. That's Old Route 1. People were coming through there and they'd see both buildings right in the middle of town. So that was an agreement. Mr. Shettleworth wouldn't take any rent. My grandfather took 2 Hudson Bay blankets across the street and gave one to Earle's dad and one to Earle's mother. And that created a really wonderful, warm feeling between the two that continued through the years.
He soon opened 3 more stores in Greater Portland. Earle's parents had become fixtures in the Portland community. In 1943, Earle's sister Sarah was born, and on August 17, 1948, Earle G. Shettleworth Jr. arrived on the scene. Almost from birth, Earle was an historian. He did normal Maine kid things, like riding his bike, swimming, and horsing around, but his interest in history emerged early.
I look back on it now for many years and I realize how extremely fortunate I was. I had an extraordinary pair of parents. By the time I was 4 years old, I was evincing this interest in history. And it really came from the fact that my father brought home from his store this remaindered series called The Illustrated History of Britain that had been published just at the time of World War II, and it somehow made its way across the ocean and into his store in Freeport. And I was just absolutely fascinated going through page after page of these illustrations about British history from the Roman times up into the 19th century, and that kind of hooked me. And so, you know, very quickly they responded to the fact of what I was interested in. And they were marvelous in terms of encouraging it all the way, right up to the time I, left the nest, so to speak, after college. And what I remember in particular in the way of encouragement was the many family trips that we took. There would be day trips, usually on Sundays, and those would be to historic places like Portsmouth, Newburyport, Salem. There would be longer trips to Boston, to Providence, to Newport, to New York, to Washington, to Philadelphia, to Williamsburg, to Mystic, to Sturbridge. I mean, there isn't a place in the Northeast that we didn't go that had historic significance that was part of the process of encouraging my interest.
Starting in 1955, every summer Earle's parents rented a camp in East Madison, near Skowhegan, which enabled his mother to spend time with her Colby friends and provided Earle with a fertile new playground, Central Maine, for exploring Maine and his historical interests. Earle credits a family trip to Quebec when he was 7 as the moment he became a collector.
When we passed through a little town called Bingham, I saw a big antique shop. I said to my parents, on the way back, can we stop there? I really want to go in. And so, they were always very obliging and very supportive. And so we stopped. And it was run by a wonderful old couple named Morris and Barbara Alkins. And it was originally 2 stores that had been merged into one, this great big late 19th century wooden commercial building, just absolutely filled to the gills with everything, with glass, with china, with paintings, with prints, including, of course, as I soon discovered, boxes of stereopticon views at the back, and so on. And so that was my first exposure. I was 6 going on 7, and I picked out this one item that just absolutely transfixed me. And I said to my parents, I want that so. And they said, well, all right, your birthday is coming up. Your 7th birthday is coming up shortly. And we'll bring you back on your birthday to buy this. Well, what it turned out to be, and I still have it, was a print of Gilbert Stuart's George Washington painting, and it was in a crisscross Victorian frame. It was $2. They really got off cheap that year on my birthday, although I think they gave me other things as well. But you see, I was under the impression that I had found this original painting of George Washington, you know, and I must have it. And so indeed, later on, I opened up the back some years later and found that it was actually the illustration from a 1932 Washington bicentennial calendar. But, you know, I still cherish it to this day. It was my first acquisition.
He began frequenting antique stores and making connections to eminent old Mainers who had stories to tell, knowledge of Maine history, and took interest in the precocious child. Back home in Portland, Earle began to organize and share his collection. He created a museum in his bedroom. In 1961, the Portland Evening Express profiled Earle, then a 7th grader at Lincoln Junior High School. In the article, his mother expresses wonder that there's still room for the bed.
That early collecting already began to fill my room in my parents' house. And it was a very eclectic collection. I mean, it was a mixture of old photographs. There was a statue of a Civil War soldier. There was a photograph of the night staff of the Easton Argus newspaper in the 1880s. There were lots of political campaign buttons. I mean, it was a very eclectic collection. And I remember my sister, who was, among other things, very artistic, she made this beautiful sign that I still have that simply said, E. G. Shettleworth's Museum, and that was posted on the door, you know.
He also shared his collection with his fellow elementary school students, including his Edison phonograph. Earle's principal at the Heseltine School asked his mother, "Why does Earle seem so serious?" His mother responded, "He has a lot on his mind." Earle's first publication, written when he was in 6th grade, was a history of the Heseltine School when it was about to be torn down and replaced by the new Baxter Elementary School. As an 11-year-old, he boldly sought an audience with the new school's namesake, former Governor Percival Baxter, and the two hit it off. As he entered Deering High School, Earle gained a mentor who would have a profound impact on his life. Elizabeth Ring, history teacher, renowned Maine historian, and a driving force at Maine Historical Society. She recognized Earle's interest, passion, and talent. She fed him research projects, nominated him for membership at Maine Historical Society, and gave him opportunities to create exhibits. She introduced him to lifelong friend and collaborator Christopher Monkhouse.
What Elizabeth did for me, even before, you know, I had gotten to Deering High School, that summer of '63 was the first time where I was free to totally explore the Maine Historical Society. And I explored it from top to bottom. I went into nooks and crannies because I had this interest not only in books and manuscripts, but a deep interest in objects.
She also pushed him to do his first lecture on the history of Portland buildings.
We have Elizabeth, I can still see it to this day, coming up to my desk in her class and saying, I have a special assignment for you, she said. You're getting so interested in Portland architecture, because I'd been spending the summer of '63, you know, also doing some of the very first survey work of Portland architecture for Greater Portland Landmarks. And she knew this very well. And she said, I've been asked by the College Club here in Portland to give a talk on old Portland houses. And she said, actually, you're going to do it.
In high school, Earle embarked on a weekly ritual he would maintain for years that transported him back in time. Each Saturday, he made a regular circuit to Portland's antique dealers, antiquarians, and bookmen. During these visits, he befriended a cast of elders who had experienced and built deep knowledge of Maine history. He soaked in their stories and reveled in the centuries-old feel of their shops. Every Saturday morning, he would walk from his house on Hersey Street to Forest Avenue, where he caught a bus to Monument Square. His first stop was at Sam Cinnamon's, who had run a second-hand goods and antiques business since 1925. He then headed to F.O. Bailey's, run by Neil Allen Sr. From there, he visited the Century House, run by Pearl Pine at York and Brackett. After lunch, he'd visit Ruth's Boyd shop on Portland Street. Finally, he'd stop to see another of his great mentors, Francis O'Brien. Francis was a legendary bookman, philosopher, and generous soul who mentored a generation of historians, collectors, book dealers, and people throughout the community.
Francis was probably one of the most learned and erudite and in many ways thoughtful person who lived in Maine in the 20th century. He was there to sell books, but he was also there to impart his vast knowledge. He knew people all over the state because they gravitated to him for books, but also for his knowledge and his perceptions and his viewpoints and his observations. He was a great mentor. In many ways, he was an intellectual father to me.
In high school, Elizabeth Ring also brought Earle into the Sills Committee, the precursor to Greater Portland Landmarks. Landmarks was founded in response to the destruction of Portland's Union Station in 1961, which had had a huge emotional impact and was a wake-up call.
Well, I think the loss of Union Station in 1961 really caught a great many people, not only in Portland but across the state, off guard. Union Station was a magnificent building. It was sort of a grand Beaux-Arts building in the French chateau style. It was sort of the culmination of the success of railroads in Maine in the 19th century. It had been built in the late 1880s. It was really a crossroads for Maine. I think at one point I remember reading that there was somewhere between 80 and 100 trains running through there every day over a 24-hour period. So consequently, Union Station was a place that was really melded into the memories of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, in a day when railroad transportation was largely the way you traveled. And I think many people had very poignant memories of Union Station because of the wars as well. I mean, this is the station that many of the troops left from to go to training and ultimately to World War I and World War II, and then they returned as well. And so really, it was a place that was really filled with memories that cut across every segment of our lives and our society. And so when Union Station was abruptly destroyed a year after passenger service ended, and apparently the Maine Central Railroad couldn't wait to, just cash in on that piece of property. They sold it. It was destroyed before anyone could do anything about it, and of course became a strip mall, which is now, well, we won't say anymore.
Encouraged by his parents to find a summer job, Earle began writing a series of features for the Portland Evening Express. He would end up writing 52 articles about Portland architecture during his high school and college years. By the time he graduated from high school in 1966, Earle had already delivered 100 lectures on historic buildings in Portland. He had already become one of Maine's leading historians.
What a beginning. Music is the universal language of mankind. Poetry, their universal pastime and delight. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. As Longfellow scholars in the audience may know, this passage is from Outre-mer, A Pilgrimage Beyond the Sea, written in 1833. It was the first major work by Longfellow, inspired by his travels in Europe as a young man in preparation for his teaching career at his alma mater, Bowdoin College. He was 26 years old. Earle Shettleworth is the product of a loving family, a supportive community, and inspiring mentors at Deering High School, Colby College, Boston University, and beyond. His liberal arts education has allowed him to not only pursue his love of history, art, and architecture, but also music, a sometimes underappreciated but powerful form of human expression. Maine has been home to many noted writers, painters, and architects, but also composers, performers, and teachers of music as well. This evening, we're blessed to acknowledge and to honor Earle Shettleworth in a variety of ways, including with music from two exceptional contemporary artists, Edwin and Matt Cahill, who are not only admirers of Earle and his legendary career, but who are themselves adding to the rich history of music in Maine and the performing arts from their coastal home, Beckett's Castle in Cape Elizabeth. Edwin and Matt are far more qualified to introduce, and certainly to perform, their musical tribute to Earle than I am. So please welcome the founders and directors of Hogfish, Edwin and Matt Cahill.
My name is Matt Cahill, and I am the co-founder and director of Hogfish Maine, along with my husband and pianist tonight, Edwin Cahill. We were lucky enough to have Earle speak at our 2021 second inaugural season opener, thanks COVID, where he regaled a rapt audience, as only Earle can, with tales of historic Maine and the artist colony that had formed in 1874 around our home, Becket Castle, which we have been inspired to bring back in its full glory, bursting at the seams with artistic activity in our new artist residency, and hopefully not with leaks from the winter storms. The work, like history, is ongoing. In that talk, Earle shared a review of one historic artist gathering at Becket Castle where the chowder served was rated, quote, ultra plus. This has now become common parlance in our household. The frequent line drawn in the sand is, yes, but is it ultra plus? Thank you, Earle, for bringing ultra plus to our lives and for making history fun, powerful, and relevant to our community. We're still trying to find that chowder recipe. Ultra plus chowder gives some strange results on Google. The tag for Hogfish is regenerative arts. We were inspired by the regenerative agriculture movement in Maine to ask, how can the arts go beyond sustainable to be regenerative? What is regenerative to individuals, our communities, and our earth? Through creating and continued dialogue with brilliant members from our community, many of whom are in the audience today, we have discovered so much. But if one thing stands out above all the rest, it is that connection is at the heart of regeneration. In some ways, the job of a historian could be seen as a sacred keeper, a torchbearer of connections that matter, or should matter to us all. Earle, you have helped us all not to feel alone in this world, and especially in Maine, which can get quite lonesome and cold in the winter. Hogfish is inspired by you to pass the torch of keeping and telling stories that connect us all through the arts and make those harsh winter nights of the soul a little bit warmer and a little bit less lonely. Towards that end, we love to begin our events with a small invitation to connect. I invite you now to notice where you're connecting with your seat. I invite you now to notice your breath. I invite you now to notice the beautiful clothes of the people around you in honor of this day. Thank you.
My name is Edwin Cahill, and I am Matt's husband and far lesser half, and also the co-founder of Hogfish. It's a great honor to celebrate Earle Shettleworth this evening. I was born in Portland and attended Scarborough High School. I understand there's a connection with your mother. And Earle's scholarship and books were an important inspiration to me. And now for this Mainer returning home after more than 2 decades, Earle made me feel instantly welcome. He's been an extraordinary and generous source of wisdom for Hogfish and for Becket Castle as we transform it into a home for artistic creation. And he was also an extraordinary deus ex machina in our inaugural production of the Gluck opera Magic Tree, where he truly played the role of God. He's exquisite as God. Very believable. I'm honored most of all to be able to call Earle Shettleworth my friend. So for the first part of our musical tribute to Earle this evening, we have chosen 2 songs based on the poem Mondnacht, or Moonlit Night, by the great German poet Joseph von Eichendorff, written in 1837. The second setting you will hear tonight is by composer John Knowles Paine, who was born here in Portland in 1839. and is one of Earle's favorite composers. I must say, I have few friends whose favorite pop songs date from the 19th century like mine. Payne took lessons in organ and composition with Hermann Kotschmar, and after his first recital in 1857, he was appointed organist of Portland's Handel Society. A series of organ concerts around Maine raised the money for Payne to travel to Berlin, where he studied composition with Karl August Haupt. I must say also the days where organ concerts could produce profits may be long gone. But upon returning to the US in 1861, he founded Harvard University's music department and was appointed the first music professor in the United States of America. John Knowles Payne was also the first US composer to be celebrated in concert halls of Europe. And despite moving to Boston, Payne, ever the maniac, like all of us, never lost his love of nature, and he found the musical equivalent in the German Romanticism of composer Robert Schumann, whose setting of Mondnacht will be the first song you hear tonight. And this song, or lieder, was so special to the Schumanns, that Robert's wife, Clara, chose it to be performed on Robert Schumann's commemoration celebration in 1856. So Mondnacht was undoubtedly the inspiration for John Knowles Payne to write his own setting, which you will hear second. And finally, John Knowles Payne was also the first director of the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston. And so it's especially meaningful to me to perform these songs with Matt for Earle this evening, as New England Conservatory is not only my alma mater, but this song was also part of my senior recital in Boston, which launched my career. So I hope you'll find these songs to be as ultra plus as our dear friend and mentor, Earle Shettleworth.
Die Luft ging durch die Felder, die Ähren wogten sacht. Es rauschten leis die Wälder, so stemmklar war Weit ihre Flügel aus, flog durch die stille Lande, als flüge sie nach Haus.
So this second song is John Knoll's Pain setting of the very same poem. And I think we're witnessing history tonight. Even on the darkest corners of YouTube and TikTok, you cannot find a recording of this song anywhere. So it's at least the first time I've heard it, so I hope you enjoy it.
Es war, als hätte der Himmel die Erde still geküsst, dass sie im Blütenschimmer von ihm nur träumen müsst. Die Luft ging durch die Felder, die Erden wogten, wogten sacht. Es rauschen leis die Wälder, es rauschen leis die Wälder, so sternklar war die Nacht, so sternklar war die Nacht. Und meine Seele spannte weit ihre Flügel aus, und meine Seele spannte, und meine Seele spannte weit ihre Flügel aus, flog durch die stillen Lande, als flöge sie nach Haus, flög durch die stillen, stillen Lande, als flöge sie nach Haus.
Last left our hero, he had just graduated high school, and he already had a decade's worth of historian's experience under his belt. Here's part 2 of Earle's story.
Like his mother, Earle attended Colby College, where his scholarly interests focused on art history. Earle's interest in art history had been piqued through the encouragement of his friend Christopher Monkhouse in the Colby Art Museum's groundbreaking 1963 exhibition, Maine and Its Role in American Art. By the time Earle was at Colby, he was already in demand as an advisor. Grassroots efforts to preserve the row house and other buildings in Hollowell in the late 1960s marked the start of a statewide historic preservation movement in Maine. It was here that Earle met and launched a lifelong friendship and collaboration with Linda Bean.
I formed a group with some women. There were 8 of us, and we walked around town, took pictures of all the early homes, and worked our way up the hill and tried to date them. When we finished with that and gave that little album of photographs to the library, it occurred to us that we didn't know anything about the commercial buildings. David Stevens, who was then the head of the Department of Transportation, had made it clear that he wanted to tear down the commercial buildings on the river side in order to widen the highway. We didn't want that to happen. We didn't really know enough about the buildings, and I heard that Earle was at Colby. He was already well known as a knowledgeable historic preservationist. By that time, you know, he was on his way to becoming what he is today, a national treasure on Maine history and Maine architecture. So I called, and he agreed to come and help us look at those buildings. The problem was he didn't drive. He was in college and he didn't drive yet. No issue. I had children. They were around my ankles at that time, you know, little kids. And we were living in that old house, that old Dummer house, trying to restore it. And I picked him up in my car and brought him down from Waterville. And he stood there and amazed all of us. And he said, you know, we can work with the A95 review process here. That's a federally legislative mandate to investigate which is more important, for example, a highway or the historic buildings. That was how our little group led the way to saving the buildings on that street.
In 1970, Earle served a stint in the U.S. Army Reserve. In 1971, Earle entered the New American Studies program at Boston University. His mentor and friend, Abbott Lowell Cummings, taught in the program and directed the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, now Historic New England. Cummings helped Earle secure Spania's first fellowship, which helped pay for graduate school and provided remarkable research opportunities. By now, Earle was well established and had developed a committed legion of followers. Maine art critic Philip Isaacson described Earle in a 1972 Maine Sunday Telegram article. I could not think of any museum program that has given me as much pleasure as Earle Shettleworth Jr.'s recent lectures on the architecture of Portland. How does one take a lay audience, amenable to architectural history perhaps, but hardly a cadre of experts, and in a few minutes convert them into rows of note-taking building bluffs? He returned to Maine, where the infrastructure and administration of Maine's preservation movement was being put into place. In 1971, Governor Kernis appointed Earle to serve on the first board of the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. He became the commission's architectural historian in 1973 and was named its director in 1976. At 28, Earle was firmly established as a professional historian and leader who already had 2 decades of experience under his belt. For the next 40 years, Earle became the public figure that we all know. Earle traveled throughout Maine constantly, surveying buildings, advising communities, supporting local preservation efforts, providing context and technical guidance, connecting projects to resources, educating and inspiring the public, helping people and communities throughout Maine see and appreciate their part in the Maine story, and commemorating events of local, state, and national significance.
I've known Earle for over 40 years, and some of the first contacts was with establishing a downtown National Register historic district. And, 30 buildings are in the district. 20 of those were designed by the same architect. And, we worked obviously closely with Earle to get that district established.
In Augusta, he became a leader of Maine's burgeoning cultural community. He became a key counsel to legislators, providing historical information and perspective on far-ranging Maine topics.
Look, Earle is industrious, he's kind, he's smart as hell. And I've always been able to call him, even on the spur of the moment, and ask him questions. And he'll come up with the most encyclopedic answers very quickly. Well, that's why it's so important to have people like Earle Shettleworth, and he is one of a kind, to remind us of our history, remind us of what went before. That becomes very important with term limits in the legislature, for instance. People who don't remember what happened 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. what the origin of some particular law or policy is. And that's why we rely sometimes on John Martin and Solomon Millett and others with distinguished careers in public policy. But we also rely on Earle Shettleworth to remind us of our own history, of what we did before, good, bad, or indifferent.
With Earle, we can obviously go into centuries, indeed millennia of Maine history. But Earle himself, because of the many years he spent working with it and the people that he's known, is a link to history. He has known as a child Maine Civil War veterans. He can bring together that enormous arch and horizon of Maine history and offer stability from one political administration to another, from one group of people to another.
He advocated for financial support for preservation of Maine's built environment, including a barnstorming tour throughout the state in 1985 for a $2 million bond. He helped lead the effort to restore the Maine State House in 1998-2001 and collaborated closely with First Lady Karen Baldacci to restore the Olmsted-designed New England Garden at the Blaine House in 2006-2007. During Earle's tenure, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission nominated approximately 1,600 Maine properties to the National Register of Historic Places and awarded millions of dollars in federal and state grants for the preservation of historic buildings and archaeological sites. Its surveys have identified critical historic, architectural, and archaeological resources. In recognition of these many contributions, Earle was named Maine State Historian by Governor Baldacci in 2004, a role in which he continues to serve.
I think, Steve, it was probably the greatest privilege of my life. I think that I had learned early on, particularly through the role model of Governor Baxter and having the opportunity to meet and talk with him several times during the 1960s when I was very young and he was very old. The idea of the deep importance of public service and the fact that public service at its best can be a force for great good. And that is, I think, what guided me all through those 40 years. There were great moments of accomplishment, there were great moments of challenge, as there is in any job or any endeavor. I was involved in a number of very challenging preservation battles, and at the same time, some great preservation victories.
Earle's leadership of the preservation movement is just one dimension of his historical contributions to Maine. His role as a collector, historian, mentor, and teacher has had an equally important impact. The collecting Earle did as a child and teen gave him a sharp eye and foundation of knowledge. His collecting has continued unabated. From the 1960s into the 1990s, Earle scoured Maine with another important mentor and friend, James Vickery. Vickery, born in Unity in 1917, was a teacher who had been collecting early photographs of Maine since before World War II. Jim didn't drive, but by the early 1970s, Earle did. Earle regularly served as Jim's chauffeur for collecting jaunts throughout Maine. The collecting that they did individually and together forms the basis of one of Earle's legacy collections. The Vickery Shettleworth Collection of Early Maine Photography, which was established at Maine Historical Society in 2006. During his tenure in Augusta, Earle built another legacy collection, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission Photographic Collection. This collection of stereo views and real photo postcards spans from the 1850s to the 1950s and provides an invaluable, sprawling record of Maine's built and natural environment.
The Maine Historic Preservation Commission's collection is probably one of the most important collections in New England. It amounts to somewhere north of 20,000 stereo views of Maine, certainly well over 100,000 postcards. I wouldn't even dare guess how many glass negatives or mounted photographs. The magnitude is remarkable. And this really was Earle's baby. And I think one of the most important things that will be part of his legacy is, as the State Historic Preservation Officer, he had a bureaucratic role, but he also amassed a collection that makes Maine's State Historic Preservation Office absolutely unique.
Our historic buildings and historic places just do an enormous amount towards establishing, a sense of place anywhere. And I think that and those buildings also, if you are designing a building to be in the vicinity of a historic building, you learn a lot and hopefully relate the new work to the old work.
Working closely with Maine museums and close collaborators like Linda Bean, Earle has worked to make sure that critical collections, like the Maine Charitable Mechanics banners, stayed in Maine and accessible to the public, and didn't disappear into the hands of private, out-of-state collectors. Through Earle's efforts, a vast, precious record of Maine has been saved, preserved, and established.
I think one of the great things about Earle is that he understands the value of things. And it doesn't matter if it's a drawing or a photograph or a piece of ephemera. And even though his career was largely in historic preservation and the built environment, he always knows how to make connections across different disciplines. So art or architecture or material culture or social history. And I think that it's being able to make those kinds of connections that make objects and things, more relevant today.
Earle has also documented and shared the vast personal knowledge that he has built through the publication of countless books, articles, and exhibitions on topics ranging from Maine artists to photography to the histories of numerous communities. Earle has delivered 40-plus lectures per year throughout Maine for decades and shared his knowledge through thousands of conversations with colleagues, researchers, and students. His lectures have turned the public, non-historians, into avid fans, history buffs, and champions of their own communities.
He understands that interpretations of various things are changing, or activating in a collection in a particular way in 2023 is not the same way it would have been done in 1980 or 1990. And he's still here for that, right? Looking at that, pushing at those interpretations, finding more evidence, never just sitting and resting on what he already knows, like always seeking to know more.
One of the great things about Earle is that I think he's one of the most productive people I've ever met. He's not distracted by dog walking. He's not distracted by watering your house plants or mowing the lawn. And he is passionate about, focusing on the research and getting things written and distributed.
Earle is just so generous. I mean, I've never seen an instance where someone asked Earle to come speak or to do something, to look something up, that he doesn't do it. He just, he's always right there. It's amazing.
Earle is always happy to leverage his abilities and his connections for somebody else's benefit too. And I think that's really a unique characteristic of Earle.
Here's someone who, with laser focus and a very high level of talent and intellect, has done the same thing in the same place in public service for decades, at a level that's significant nationally.
We have briefly met some of the mentors, peers, and colleagues who imparted the knowledge and experience that they built over their own lifetimes with Earle. Earle, in turn, has generously and enthusiastically shared the knowledge he has built. Thousands of people across Maine, ranging from local historians to preservationists to scholars to curators and archivists to teachers to municipal and civic leaders, now carry forth his knowledge and spirit.
Earle's an incredible friend. He is one who I think really values relationships with others. He's somebody who, if he meets somebody who shares his passion, wants to support that person in any way he can. Over and over again, I'm just sort of blown away by his generosity of spirit. And he's an incredibly valued member of our community. And thank you, Earle, for everything that you've done.
Earle celebrates local knowledge and has patiently mentored communities and organizations as they have preserved collections, saved buildings, curated exhibits, built capacity, and gathered and shared their stories. Earle's life work has coincided with a 75-year time window when Maine's history and record may have been most at risk. a time when centuries-old farmsteads and homes were being dispersed, and photos, letters, journals, and plans might easily have simply disappeared. A time when much of Maine, seeking to modernize, might have simply bulldozed or torn down thousands of buildings that now remain, and which are central to Maine's sense of place and the spirit and identity of towns, villages, and cities throughout the state.
It really comes down to a lot about, what makes Maine Maine. And I think without Earle, Maine would be a decidedly lesser place, and I think it would be certainly less, quote unquote, Maine.
Earle has done all of this with generosity, a sense of humor, and a smile on his face. The collections, knowledge, and perspectives that Earle has saved, stewarded, and imparted document what makes Maine Maine and provide a sense of wonder and foundation of knowing that will be critical to Maine's vitality in its third century.
Well, Earle, I hope we did justice to your story, because you're quite a fact checker. It's now my pleasure to introduce one of Earle's good friends and close collaborators, Karen Baldacci. Karen served as First Lady of Maine from 2003 to 2011, a period of great support for and energy within Maine's cultural community. Karen worked closely with Earle on many projects, and the two had the opportunity to tour many of Maine's historical and cultural sites together. So it's my pleasure to invite Karen up.
Good evening. It's an honor for me to be asked to speak on my perspective, or my memories, or basically stories what I consider from my heart, that involved Earle Shettleworth. I may not even need these glasses, but we'll see. Tonight we are gathered to honor and celebrate Earle Shettleworth, a man who celebrated and honored the state of Maine throughout his career. Tonight we honor the man who honors us. I'd also like to recognize my husband, the 73rd Governor of Maine, who accompanied me tonight. Thank you to Steve Bromage and the entire Maine Historical Society crew for inviting me. The invitation came with the request to limit my remarks, so in trying to adhere to the 3 B's of public speaking, I'll try to be brief, be good, and be gone. Our nation has had its accomplished historians and the likes of Ken Burns, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and David McCullough. Our state has Earle Shettleworth, who's an amazing scholar, as we all know, and of Maine history and architecture. And he is Maine's 6th state historian. What I'm sharing you are my memories from 2003 to 2011 and the 8 years that we lived at the Blaine House. The Office of Historic Preservation in Augusta is across the street from the front door of the Blaine House on the State Street side. And Earle's career has been one of public service. He's had years and years of collaboration and connections with communities, individuals from Maine. We worked together with the Friends of the Blaine House and on the Maine's Arts and Cultural Affairs Committees, I should say a group. And early on in our relationship, when John and I first came to Augusta, and I met Earle, spoke to Earle, my question to him is, what is it that makes Maine so special? Why do we need to know? What do we need to see? What do we need to experience to learn Maine's story? And luckily for us, he was right next door. For the next 8 years, Sue Plummer, who was the former Blaine House manager for several governors, and also my First Lady's assistant when we had our time in Augusta. For the next 8 years, Sue and I, Earle, and a van named Chitty, planned day trips or excursions with Earle to explore Maine. I often think of it as John Steinbeck had Travels with Charlie, and Sue and I and Earle had Travels with Chitty. So we visited communities of Bethel, South Paris, Islesboro, Wiscasset, Bar Harbor, Kennebunkport. As you can see, we had many trips together, Rockland, Portland, and were offered an insider's look into historical and cultural sites, museums, and given the red carpet treatment from all of you with historical societies, and each and every one of you in this room has a testimonial or a story to share about how Earle has impacted Maine in our lives. What specifically comes to mind, I recall, is a ferry trip from Port Clyde out to Monhegan. It's a long ferry ride if you've ever taken it. We started from Port Clyde out. It's about 10 to 12 miles on a ferry boat traveling, you're lucky, 40 miles an hour. It was a ferry full of people, and on the way, Earle began to share, as he usually did on these trips, where we're going, who we're going to see, what's valuable, what we should do or not do. And by the time, Monhegan, the artist colony, by the time we got there, Sue and I realized that we weren't the only ones on the ferry. It was people listening in, hearing his words, his story, wanting to know, one of those what I call Paul Harvey moments, where we wait to hear the rest of the story. And by the time we docked it, why aren't people getting up? Why aren't they leaving? Because they wanted to wait, wanted to hear more about what the rest of the story was. And that is, in my memory, what holds Earle so dear to our time that we had in Augusta. His generosity in sharing his knowledge, which captivates and endears us all. He was the go-to guy, as we've seen and learned. And still 20 years later, there are times and moments when I think, what would Earle think about this? What has Earle got to say about this? The two major projects that we collaborated on together in 2006 was the restoration of the Blaine House, New England garden and greenhouse, and the Frederick Law Homestead built in 1920 under Governor Milken. This garden I consider to be one of the hidden gems in Augusta, especially now when the summer season's peaking and the garden's coming into fruition. You do have to make an appointment. I don't know with COVID and what's going on at the Blaine House these days, I have not been back. But in our days there, you had to make an appointment to do a self-guided tour, and there's also a brochure that has been developed. And in 2008, we celebrated the Blaine House's semi-sesquicentennial, easier said as the 175th birthday of the Blaine House. And it was, what we tried to do was invite back former governors' families to visit and to share their stories of their time or their chapter when they were in Augusta or when their husband or their spouse was serving as governor. So we heard the stories about squirrels in the dining room, alligators in the bathtubs. We had goats and sheep in the backyard, and then runaway teenagers on the top of the Widow's Lookout. It also we had a dinner in the Hall of Flags at the state capitol. Attending were the governors John Baldacci, Joe Brennan, John McKernan, John Reed, and Angus King. It was a celebratory, very memorable event, which helped us establish an endowment for the Blaine House. And at the end of the evening, we had fireworks, if I recall right. So secondly, there is a portrait family gallery in the Blaine House, in the pool room. So if you make it down to visit the gardens, take a tour of the Blaine House and check out those families that previously lived there. The photos are on the wall. We also commissioned a painting to be done by Paul Plummer, who was an artist in Hollowell, who painted a picture of the gardens in bloom. So in closing and keeping it brief, I just want to read a quote that Earle made to Maine Magazine in 2018. So knowledge of local, state, and national history is essential in defining the truth of who we are, where we've been, and where we hope to go. Earle, I want to thank you for being you, for giving your time and expertise in preserving Maine and sharing Maine's many stories, which make this place our place, what we call home. Especially the time you spent with Sue and I and Chitty. You are truly one of Maine's treasures, a true Maine history maker.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'd now like to invite Maine Historical Society's Board Chair Eileen Skinner and Earle Shettleworth to join us on stage.
Wow. Well, we won't have time for that 20-page speech I was going to give. Thank goodness. So I want to accomplish two things while I'm up on stage. First, before the time goes by, I want to recognize Steve Bromwich, our consummate executive director. I can't tell you how much time Steve and the staff, and Steve personally, as you can tell by the narration, devoted to this event tonight. So thank you, Steve. Thank you, all the staff who are out there for the work you did on tonight. It's just first class. Thanks again. And I want to thank Karen Baldacci and Governor Baldacci for being here tonight. I was there at that event at the Blaine House when you had the governors there. I will remember it always. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for being here tonight. And then, of course, Earle. So I'm a native New Orleanian and have been in Maine for about 20 years now. Yeah, because I look so young. So I just can't imagine, being on the stage with you tonight. I love Maine. I love Maine history. And of course, I've crossed paths with Earle, many times in these 20 years. So it is just an honor to be on stage with a intergalactically renowned Maine historian. So Earle, I want to thank you for preserving Maine's history, for preserving Maine's stories, and thank God, preserving Maine buildings and touching so many lives and so many communities. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So on behalf of Maine Historical Society, I want to present you with the 2023 Maine History Maker Award. Congratulations.
Well, goodness, where does one begin after all of this? I hardly recognize this person. So I am deeply honored by this evening, by the Maine Historical Society, which has been such an important part of my life for the last 60 years. Moreover, I am honored by each one of you, so many wonderful, familiar faces as I look across the room this evening. I am reminded of President Kennedy's remark when he hosted a dinner for Nobel Prize winners at the White House, quote, "I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." So consider yourself complimented. A special thanks to Karen Baldacci for her kind words, and to Steve Bromwich and Christina Tracer for their work in making this event possible. Two of my family members are with us tonight. Just realized I should shift my glasses here. The distance ones usually work, but these work better. Two of my family members are with us tonight. My nephew, Sebastian Mrosovsky of New York City, and my cousin, Ford Reike of Freeport, whose grandfather was my uncle, Howard Reike Sr., the longtime principal of Portland High School, for whom the Reike School is named. I would not be here this evening if it were not for several mentors who guided and inspired me as I began my life's work, and you've already been introduced to some of them through the films. They include my parents, Esther and Earle Shettleworth, Frances O'Brien, Elizabeth Ring, Christopher Monkhouse, James Vickery, my Colby College professors, James Carpenter and William Miller, my Boston University Graduate School professor, Abbott Lowell Cummings, and James Mundy, the first director of the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. As Sir Isaac Newton wrote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." This evening, I want to focus on another mentor in my life, Mildred Burridge, a major cultural figure in the life of 20th century Maine. Well, we are told that 6 degrees of separation connect us to those of our own time. There are also historical degrees of separation by which we are linked to those from the past. For me, the artist and preservationist Mildred Burridge was such a connection through her vivid memories of such notable Maine figures as her father Henry Burridge's friend, Joshua Chamberlain. Mildred's first encounter with the famed Civil War general and Bowdoin College president took place at 6 years old in 1896, when she was with her father on a train returning to Portland from a visit with her grandfather in Bangor. When Chamberlain boarded the train in Brunswick, he joined Burridge in conversation as Mildred looked on in fascination. You can just see the picture, 2 middle-aged Civil War veterans sitting across from each other in the plush parlor car of a train of the 1890s, with a little girl transfixed by these 2 gentlemen in conversation. As the train arrived at Portland's Union Station, Chamberlain drew a booklet about himself from his valise, signed and dated it, 1896, and handed it to Mildred as a souvenir. More than 80 years later, she told me this story as she passed the Chamberlain booklet on to me. I first met Mildred Burridge in the summer of 1968, when I was 20 and she was 78. With nearly 60 years separated us in age, we shared a passion for Maine history. That year, I was in my 4th season as a summer reporter for the Portland newspapers. Eddie Fitzpatrick, the features editor of the Maine Sunday Telegram, asked me to write a series of articles about the 3 most well-preserved communities in Maine. My selection of Wiscasset, Castine, and Paris Hill was made in consultation with Francis O'Brien, the Dean of Maine Antiquarian Booksellers, who was a close friend and mentor. So broad were Francis's contacts throughout the state that he could recommend knowledgeable individuals for me to interview in all 3 communities. The artist Mildred Burridge and her sister, jewelry maker Madeline Burridge, topped the list for Wiscasset. On a warm August morning, Mildred Burridge ushered me in to the front parlor of the Federal Period House that she shared with her sister on Lee Street in Wiscasset. Mildred quickly proved to be a young reporter's dream, requiring little prompting as she traced Wiscasset's historical development and the reasons for its preservation as Maine's prettiest village in the 20th century. For the next 2 hours, my pen raced across the paper as I took notes. As I left, I remarked on the crossed swords and the sash that hung above the arch between the first and back halls. Mildred explained that they had belonged to her father, Major Henry S. Burridge, who had served in the 36th Massachusetts Regiment during the Civil War. His wartime experiences included seeing Abraham Lincoln on 3 occasions and being held captive in Richmond's Confederate Libby prison. By the time my Wiscasset article was published in September 1968, I had started my junior year at Colby. The following spring of 1969, the Maine Historical Society was engaged in a contentious election for president, with one candidate defending the established order and the other seeking to reform the bylaws to bring the organization into the 20th century. We've, I think, just about made it. Mildred Burridge and I were on the side of the reformers, whose candidate lost by 10 votes. As I left the Society's headquarters after the vote that afternoon, Mildred saw that I was visibly upset. In her characteristically determined spirit, she sought to comfort me by simply declaring, "Now don't worry, we'll just outlive them." Mildred's prophecy proved true. For 8 years later, in 1977, I was elected president of the Maine Historical Society at the age of 29. Come the revolution. Well, that was the 60s and the 70s. In the spring of 1969, Mildred Burge learned that I would be traveling in Europe that summer. She contacted me to say that she needed my help to open properties of the Lincoln County Cultural and Historical Association, the Powellboro Courthouse, the old jail, and the jailer's house, all buildings that she had been instrumental in preserving. For 3 weeks of work in Dresden and Wiscasset, I would receive $250 that I could apply toward my European trip. Those 3 weeks in June 1969 provided me with the opportunity to get to know the Burge sisters. Assisting Mildred was an intense experience because of the energetic way in which she approached every project, whether it was mounting an exhibit or creating one of her abstract paintings. While she had little time for lunch, I was rewarded each evening with a delicious dinner prepared by Madeline, an accomplished cook who had attended Fannie Farmer's Boston cooking school in her youth. Served on TV trays in the front parlor, these meals provided a chance for the sisters to regale their young guest with the stories of their past. As the evening progressed, the room became alive with the memory of their father's friend, Joshua Chamberlain, American Impressionist painters in France before World War I, novelists Booth Tarkington and Kenneth Roberts, and art historian Erwin Panofsky, all people they had known very well. Mildred spoke in emphatic, declarative sentences and a cultivated accent, while Madeline laced her conversation with dry humor and frequent laughter. When my 3 memorable weeks in Lincoln County ended, Mildred Burge lent me her 1909 edition of the Baedeker Guide to Paris, saying that while it was 60 years old, the city probably hadn't changed that much since she was there before World War I. When I came back from Europe in September 1969 for my senior year at Colby, I dutifully returned the book. Years later, I found it while helping to settle her estate, and it remains one of my treasured possessions. During my final year at Colby, I took a senior seminar in art history taught by my department chair, Professor James Carpenter. One of my assignments was to interview an artist and report my findings to the class. This led to my tape recording a long interview with Mildred Burge about her 60-year career as an artist. She shared with me her experiences as a young American woman from Maine in France from 1909 to 1914. Her recollections included friendships with American Impressionist painters and their families, a chance meeting with Claude Monet, exhibitions of Picasso and Matisse in Paris when the oil paintings were still fresh, maybe even still wet, put on display. A visit to Gertrude Stein's salon and the outbreak of World War I in Europe. She described her discovery of abstract art in New York during World War II and how it transformed her work. Finally, she discussed her friendships with Maine artists such as Marguerite and William Zorak. My graduation from Colby in June 1970 was followed by 2.5 years of graduate school at Boston University. When I returned to Maine in 1973 to work for the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, I resumed my visits with the Burge sisters. Once again, I spent hours in their company, reliving the events of their colorful lives. Mildred was also keenly interested in discussing the state's current cultural scene. During one of these visits, she remarked that if I was going to live in Maine, the only way to avoid becoming provincial was to read the Sunday edition of the New York Times each week. I took this advice to heart and have not missed an issue in 50 years. Madeline Burge died in 1976. Mildred remained active as an artist until she entered a nursing home after suffering a stroke at the age of 90 in 1980. I visited her there several times during the last 3 years of her life. During one of her conversations with me, she declared, "Here I am, after all these years, still living on grandfather's stick money." Her reference was to her mother's father, Moses Giddings of Bangor, who had amassed a fortune in the lumber trade during the mid-19th century. To the end of her life, Mildred Burge remained an active participant in Maine's history and culture. Her father, Henry Burge, had been Maine's first state historian, and I trust that she would be pleased that I have served in that position since 2004, having been first appointed by Governor Baldacci, whom we are deeply honored to have with us this evening. I often reflect upon how influential Mildred was in shaping my sense of the state's past. During our 15-year friendship, she provided a living link to figures and events of distant times. And now I just want to share with you as I end a quote from Mildred. In 1951, Dr. Julius Seeley Bixler, who was president of Colby at the time, who was deeply committed to the arts, particularly to art and music, established those departments at the college. He wanted to do a study of the future of the arts at Colby, and particularly what the art history curriculum would be, the creative arts curriculum, and the dream of a new museum. Bear in mind, this is 1951, and the museum becomes a reality in 1959. One of the people he turns to for ideas is Mildred Burge. And in true Mildred Burge fashion, she creates not just a report on those issues, but a voluminous and remarkable report on the whole state of the arts in Maine in the post-war period. It's a remarkable document. And embedded into that document are the following ideas. This is Mildred speaking in 1951. I had lived through 2 world wars. No peace was in sight. What had we done to hold on to our civilization? Was it leaving us? After all, what is civilization but the byproduct of man's creative thought as it shapes his life and the things he plans and does? What is peace but a byproduct of a satisfactory creative adjustment to the life where activities are used to build up and not to tear down? Where had we gone astray? I came back to Maine after the war, thinking that perhaps in the arts, the creative way of life, lay a way to peace that had never been fully explored. How to make that come clear, to bring it into daily life, I looked at all endeavors in the arts with a fresh eye. Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to welcome Edwin and Matt back on stage for one more performance.
Just to finish with something quick, at the first lunch that we were lucky enough to have with Earle, we asked, is there any food that you enjoy or are avoiding? And he responded that, rough quote, he knew it was ironic being the Maine state historian, but he did not eat any seafood. So this song is in honor of that very wise decision. Down by the sea lived a lonesome oyster, every day getting sadder and moister. He found his home life awfully wet and longed to travel with the upper set. Poor little oyster. Fate was kind to that oyster, we know, when one day the chef from Rockland's Primo saw that oyster lying there and said, I'll put you on my bill of fare. Lucky little oyster. See him on the silver platter, watching the queens of fashion chatter, hearing the wives of millionaires discuss their marriages and their love affairs. Thrilled little oyster. See that bivalve social climber feeding the rich Mrs. Rockefeller. Think of his joy as he gaily glides down to the middle of her gilded insides. Proud little oyster.
After lunch, Mrs. R complains and says to her hostess, "I've got such pains. I came to town on my yacht today, but I think I'd better hurry back to Penobscot Bay." Scared little oyster. Off they go through the troubled tide, the yacht rolling madly from side to side. They're tossed about till that poor young oyster finds that it's time he should quit his cloister. Up comes the oyster. Back once more where he started from, he murmured, "I haven't a single qualm, for I've had a taste of society, and society has had a taste of me." Wise little oyster.
Thank you all so much for joining us this evening, but I'd like to stop and say one more time, thank you, Earle, for all you have done for Maine.
Okay, let's be honest. Earle Shettleworth is history in Maine. He was there during the administration of Joshua Chamberlain. He was there with Percival Baxter when he set up Baxter. No, I'm just kidding. Earle, you know that I am.
You know you're in Earle's good graces when that manila envelope lands on your desk addressed to you with a clipping, a piece of a newspaper, a deaccessioned item from his personal collections, something that made him think of you and that he wanted you to have. And when you see that envelope come on your desk, you're like, oh, I wonder, like, what did Earle send me today?
His enthusiasm is remarkable because there are days that I'll get 2 or 3 or 4 padded yellow mailers in my mailbox. I'll open it up, it's just this explosion of padded mailers.
Oh, I get them all the time. You'd think, that, today most people I know would send me a PDF.
I'm amazed. Sometimes it's almost every day or every other day that I'll get something that he'll slip into the mail.
He must send out half a dozen every single day. And then when he's got a new article, he probably sends out 150 of these things. I was curious where he sourced his. I don't know if there's a Staples in Hallowell or where he gets them.
Earle once observed that our history is as important as our mountains and our oceans, and it's the heart of who we are as a state. And Earle has dedicated his entire life to preserving and projecting that history and making it available to Maine people. Earle, you're a historic treasure in your own right. It was an honor for me to get to know you and work with you over the years. Congratulations for receiving this well-deserved honor. I can't think of a better person to receive an honor from the Historical Society than Earle Shettleworth. Thanks, man. What you've done for Maine is immeasurable.